All right, today we wanted to break down a little bit about regulation and what's happening with crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all those things really that apply to not only what's been happening over the past few hearings that we've publicized here on this show, but also looking forward, because there could be quite a few things that start to lay up in toward what the SEC has been doing, along with what we're now seeing around the major investment institutions that are starting to play ETFs, et cetera. So we wanted to get an expert on this. I think you guys are going to like this show for sure. My name is Paul Barron. Welcome back into Tech Path. This is going to be a good one because we're going to have Chris Giancarlo on, and we're going to break into a little bit about. He was the gentleman that was on the in one of the hearings last week that we really kind of showcased around a timeline. And I'll get to that here in a second. But I want to open up with a couple of things for you guys, and you'll probably remember this video that we did. It was this one right here. It was the Coinbase. When Coinbase, Robinhood, the CFTC, all of them were essentially there together, starting to testify around where the SEC was going. And it was a very significant one. I think this might have been the one hearing that got a lot of people's attention at the lawmaker level, as well as the rest of the industry, both from an investor standpoint, but also I think from a participant standpoint, people like you that are watching our show. But I want to go to this first clip so you'll kind of get a precursor to what we're going to be talking about today.
And here we are today, 5 years later, still seeking that thoughtful and balanced response from Congress. Crypto's not going away. Digital assets and other network technology is like a roaring wind. You can take shelter from it, get blown away by it, or hitch a sail and ride it. And I added that we Americans prefer to ride the wind.
All right, so there it is. So let me welcome in today Chris Giancarlo. And great to have you on the show, Chris, former chair, of course.
Well, it's good to be with you.
CFTC. Yeah,
Thanks
so
for the
let's get in.
opportunity to speak with you this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And so obviously, as the former chair of the CFTC, one of the things that you've had a chance to do is work with the SEC before. And you've also seen probably this kind of scenario play out a little bit from a standpoint of, chairing the Commodities Commission. And when you look at those kind of scenarios and where we are today, you've seen regulation. Regulation now we've got really kind of coming from both sides. You've had a chance to see the current regulation on what's being proposed. First of all, what are your thoughts on the current regulatory framework that is being proposed today?
Well, it arrives at a time when regulators are struggling to apply 90-year-old statutes to a 21st century technology. And the shortcomings of those existing legislative frameworks are showing themselves. One of the shortcomings is that for historically very logical reasons, the CFTC oversees derivative markets on commodities, but doesn't oversee markets for commodities themselves. Now, you may say that's odd because the flip side is, in the world of securities, the SEC oversees both what they call the spot or the cash markets and the derivative markets on securities. Both over on the CFTC side of the ledger, the CFTC only oversees the derivative markets, futures, swaps, options, but not the underlying commodity markets themselves. Now, There's a very simple answer for that, and that is, traditionally, commodity markets were regulated by state and local legislation. Your local jewelry store sells gold. You don't want the federal government regulating gold sales, but you do want the federal government regulating gold options or gold futures markets, and so on and so forth. Grain markets are regulated at the local level, but grain futures are are overseen at the federal level. So when now we come to crypto, something that doesn't come out of the ground like most of those other commodities, in the case of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which we have determined, I say that when I was at the CFTC, we determined Bitcoin to be a commodity, and subsequent chairs have determined Ethereum to be a commodity. The CFTC has clear regulatory authority over the derivatives on them, options, swaps, futures.
Right.
But the spot market is unregulated by the CFTC, and for the most part, unregulated at the state and local level. So what does that bring us to? It brings us to a gap in coverage at the federal level for regulation of crypto. And the proposal being put forward in this piece of legislation to originate with the Senate. I'm sorry, with the House Agricultural Committee, which is the committee of oversight for the CFTC, is that that gap would be closed and the CFTC would be given authority over those spot markets, or the it's not really physical delivery in the sense of old commodities that come out of the ground, but spot or immediate delivery markets for Bitcoin and Ethereum, that the CFTC's authority would be extended to that. It's something I support. The CFTC, starting with Bitcoin futures, which I had the privilege as chairman to greenlight the launch of those marketplaces in 2017, has
Right.
functioned very, very well. One of the
Mhm.
untold stories in crypto is how well CFTC oversight over Bitcoin and Ethereum futures have functioned for the last 5 years. And during that time, the CFTC, as a federal regulator, has gained a remarkable degree of experience in the underlying products, sufficient for it, I believe, to step into this gap and become a regulator of spot markets for digital commodities.
Yeah. All right. So, do you have any issues with the current bills that they're being proposed right now? There seems to be some consensus from both parties that they are coming together. Is it likely that we're going to see something come through in this particular, session of Congress?
Well, in the House, I think there's a very good chance. Whether it would pass both houses, the House and the Senate, I don't know. But I think there's a
Yeah.
very good chance the House. I've spoken to Senate Finance Committee. I'm sorry, House Finance Committee Chairman Patrick McHenry, and he believes he has support on his side of the aisle and his caucus as the majority to pass the bills once they've finally gone through committee and have ironed out and worked out some of the kinks in them. But he's not trying to approach this on a one-party basis. He's actively seeking Democrat support, and I was very pleased to see at my hearing a number of the leading Democrats on the House Agricultural Committee, which is the oversight of the CFTC, as I said, voice support for this piece of legislation. So I think it's very likely to get a solid amount of Democrat support. I think he believes he's got the votes on the Republican side. So I really do think these companion piece of legislation could pass this Congress. Now, what happens in the Senate? It's a completely different um, House. It's a different. Under different hands. There's different
Right.
voices. Elizabeth Warren is dramatically and diametrically opposed to crypto, and she holds a lot of sway there. So the Senate is a different thing. But I think passing the House is important. I think it's a statement of growing political support for a smart and sensible framework. And that clip you showed. Thank you for showing that. What I was referring to when I said 5 years ago was an appearance I made before that Senate Banking Committee in early 2018, in February 2018, whereas then as chairman of the CFTC, I called on Congress to come up with a smart and bespoke or customized framework for crypto. And I said then, and I say it again today, crypto's not going away. It's only grown in those 5 years. It's growing globally. Our economic adversaries and our economic competitors around the world are building those bespoke frameworks for crypto. And it's quite remarkable that in the 5 years since I made those remarks, we still haven't gotten something through Congress.
So I look at this a couple of ways. Obviously, we have a large audience that is very pro crypto, and they look at what's been happening with the SEC in a very interesting light. Now, I won't say all negative, because I think they still are saying, hey, we do want protections, obviously, from our investment statuses out there. But at the same time, we don't want to be held back from what has been happening from, really, if you look at the rest of the world, what we're starting to see take place. When you look at the SEC and the CFTC, is it normal for these two organizations to work together to possibly kind of, like you said, that gray area that is in between the two, where some could cover certain areas and the CFTC could cover other areas?
Well, sadly, there's nothing in law that says the two agencies must work together. It's been more toned from the top. It has been up to the respective chairs of the two agencies and the commissioners on the agencies over the course of the last 40 years to determine whether they'll work together, whether they won't. I would say the history is somewhat sad, and that more often than not, the agencies have not worked well together, have not harmonized under both Republican and Democrat administrations. I was, I think, somewhat unique in that I had spent 30 years in the private sector. I call myself an accidental regulator. I was very pleased to serve at the CFTC, but I brought with me uh, what I'd learned in the private sector, that organizations must work together. I came as a simple taxpayer. I thought it was absolutely not in the taxpayer's interest for the agencies not to work together. So very early on, I sat down with Jay Clayton, also a business person, first time in government, at the SEC, and pledged that we would work well together. And as I explained in my book, Crypto Dad, Clayton and I would meet roughly every 6 weeks or so for dinner. And usually over a plate of spaghetti in some back room, we would come up with a list of unresolved issues between our two agencies and go through them. And usually it came down, look, you get these three figured out, I'll get these three figured out. And when we sit down again 6 weeks from now, let's see how much of that we could tick off our lists. And we were actually going through our back cupboards of the agencies, finding all these unresolved issues and getting them cleared up. And I think that continued under my successor, Heath Charbert. But I'm not so sure we're in that same place today. I think the agencies are in, once again, sort of back to their standard state of rivalry with one another, which is unfortunate.
Last question before I jump to this next section. Because you had mentioned if we do get Bitcoin and even Ethereum that falls under the CFTC, is there enough budget there for the CFTC to be able to mandate really, management and operations over a market that could grow exponentially, maybe even at one day be bigger than gold?
Well, the budget issue is an issue, but it's no different for the CFTC than it is for the SEC. The SEC's budget is 3 times the size of the CFTC's. Its staff is 3 times the size of the CFTC's, right, and its responsibilities are 3 times the size of the CFTC's. Crypto is a big new area, so either agency will have to secure the necessary funds to be able to fund oversight of this. That's not a distinction between one agency and the other. Both agencies, or either agency, will have to secure the necessary funding to undertake this initiative. And if you, as you did, listen to that hearing, I would say probably good 40% of the conversation was about the issue of funding, and one that I very much feel, and I fought for funding hard when I was at the CFTC. I don't think it's a partisan issue. Adequate funding is necessary to do a proper job.
All right, so that's good to know. I mean, because I think that's going to be obviously a big framework in being able to grow a market like this. We're going to see natural growth mainly because of the global pressures that are being out there. Being able to handle this at the governmental level is going to be really critical. I want to jump to this next clip, Chris, because I think you made a really good point right here. Listen in.
You make 3 recommendations to improve the discussion draft. The first is that the bill should impose a deadline on the CFTC and the SEC. Why do you think that's important?
There's nothing like, I've learned in business, 30 years in business, there's nothing like a deadline to get something done. And without a deadline, one tends to go to other things on one's priority list.
All right, so I think this was we even mentioned it when we did coverage on the event. This is, to me, was one of the biggest takeaways, is that a deadline really is needed. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see this laggardness behavior coming out of government and our lawmakers while the rest of the world is starting to move. Do you feel like that's something that can be imposed upon the SEC and or even Congress?
Yes. It's interesting, Paul, that if we were talking about a corporation, the requirement that I propose for a deadline would be nothing remarkable whatsoever, right? We couldn't even imagine undertaking a major project in the business world without deadlines. And somehow, when we're talking about government, it's even remarkable that someone like me would propose that there be deadlines. It shouldn't be remarkable. It should be standard operating procedure. If you want to do something and do something right, you've got to set deadlines. Now, unfortunately, deadlines can be missed, but you need to set some expectation of deliverables when it needs to be done. And as you mentioned a minute ago, we need to make sure the funding is there. But look, we've got to recognize America doesn't operate in a vacuum. The U.S. economy is part of the global economy. Our economic competitors, our economic adversaries are embracing the future in the form of digital networks of finance, and we're still trying to figure out which agency should handle which portion of
Yeah.
it and what the legal framework should be. And we've got to move beyond. We've got to be grown up about this. We've got to come up with a legal framework that makes sense, as other nations are doing, and it can be done. We've got to fund it, and we've got to set deadlines to get it done, and get out of our own way and get on with this, because the future is not going to stop because America's unprepared or still
Yeah.
arguing over politics in Washington.
Well, that's a good segue into our next tweet here. We put this tweet out last week, and it was really our breakdown of the markets and crypto assets regulation out of the EU. Some of the key things that are in this, of course, was the MiCA publication there you see. And then also within it, let me kind of highlight that, this was these consultation packages that seem to be starting to happen now and going all the way through into this year. I'm assuming that's where these people who are getting ready to register is going to go in with MiCA, the regulators, and say, hey, here's the things we're going to be doing. How shall we put this together? Is that a normal procedure of once that something from a regulation standpoint is put in place, much like what Coinbase, many of the people who've said, hey, we've tried to go to the SEC, there's not been that approach done. First of all, is that the way it would happen here within a regulatory framework?
Yeah. Again, isn't it interesting, once again, that the question is whether all of these a series of consultations should be remarkable. What is a consultation? The regulator says, we're thinking about this. Please tell us, the public, what you think. Write to us. Tell us your ideas. Then we will incorporate them, and we will once again, consultation number 2, say, okay,
Right.
we're now better informed. We're proposing this. What does the private sector think? And the private sector responds. Okay, that shouldn't be remarkable. In fact, what the Europeans are doing is modeled on what we do when we do things right in the US. It's called notice and comment. All the
Yep.
agencies have a process of rule proposals where they publish a draft for notice and comment, and then the public has time to respond with letter writing, which will hopefully improve the final product. That's what we should be doing here. Instead of what we're doing is making rulemaking through enforcement.
Yeah.
We're not telling people, how government wishes to accommodate this new innovation. We're saying you need to abide by laws written in the 1930s, and if you don't, we're going to sue you, and we're going to leave it to the courts to figure out whether we're right or whether we're wrong, or whether you're right, whether you're wrong. We're putting aside our own legacy of really smart approaches to this, which is public and private consultation. Whenever America does big things, it's always a partnership between the public and the private, whether it's landing a man on the moon or building the internet. But somehow we're falling into a hole here where it seems to be regulators saying we know what's best, and you just operate at your peril until you find yourself with a Wells notice from us, and then we'll see you in court. That's the wrong way to go about technological innovation. It's the un-American way. It's not keeping with our own traditions that others, like the Europeans, have now adopted for their betterment, and we somehow seem to have walked away from the very smart way that we've usually done things in the past.
Chris, do you think that we could, once that we get this hopefully underway and we've got some clarity coming out, do you feel that we could be on track to catch up with what's happening in the EU? And I say we, the US, and also the rest of the world. If you look at the Pacific Rim, what's happening in both China and Japan, can we accelerate fast enough and get back in the game?
Well, the old American way used to be, let's get out ahead and make them catch up to us. Now somehow we're worried about whether we'll be able to catch up to them, which is unfortunate. And what the difference between then and now is the regulatory state on steroids that is trying to make value judgments about a new innovation, which is really unfortunate. Do I think we can catch up if Europe gets? Of course we can, because nobody does technology better than we do when we do it. But we are not going to have the same impact on the Internet of finance, the Internet of value, that we had 20 years ago, 25 years ago on the Internet of Information. In that wave, we were so far ahead of the rest of the world. In some
Exactly.
ways, they're still catching up. On this wave, we've gotten our own way on this. And why do I say that? I mean, there's plenty of people out there that want to go around and say crypto is a fraud and all that. Yeah, there's plenty of fraud in it. Wherever you have money, you will have fraudsters and scammers. But the flaw in that argument is they're only looking at crypto as these various tokens. They're not seeing it for what it is, which is a truly new architecture of finance and banking and money itself, where value, rather than recorded on the balance sheet of a proprietary commercial institution, a bank or an asset manager or a retirement fund, where value is actually recorded on some form of the internet, some public or private digital network. That's a new architecture of finance that is going to sweep the globe with its speed, its efficiency, its durability, its open architecture, its access. And we are unfortunately losing time because we're arguing over, Sam Bankman-Fried and this scandal and that scandal, and missing the opportunity to lead this. There will always be scandals when it comes to money. I ran an agency with law enforcement power. We ran down one bad guy after another, and they will be there to the end of time. Wherever you have people and their money, there'll be somebody who's trying to get between that and do it. And that's why you do need good regulation. You do need law enforcement. Agencies like the SEC and the CFTC have very important roles to play. But they need to understand their role is not to get in the way of technology, but to harness it, figure it out, so you can be there and prevent scandals like the ones that have happened. That unfortunately my former regulatory counterpart, the SEC, wasn't there to prevent. In some ways, because they resisted the innovation as opposed to co-opting it, as we did at the CFTC when we greenlighted Bitcoin futures, a market in which there have been very little scandals in the last 5 years. In fact, the one piece of the FTX empire to continue to stand is the one piece that was registered with the CFTC.
Interesting.
Ledger X.
Warren Davidson put out his SEC Stabilization Act, and it mainly was, kind of the rulemaking enforcement and kind of the investigations that would be kind of flipped. His new structure was the one. Let me kind of highlight that right here. Old structure, more driven from a top-down, versus new structure, getting the commissioners involved and then reporting back into the executive director. Do you think this is a possibility that we could see the SEC get restructured in any way?
I have to be honest with you, Paul. I haven't spent a lot of time studying that proposal by Warren Davidson, and I can't say I'm a CFTC alumni. I haven't spent time at the SEC. I can't say I'm an expert on what works right, what works wrong. What I can tell you is the structure at the SEC is very similar to the one at the CFTC. And the CFTC is a very healthy agency that has functioned well under both Republicans and Democrats. Its current chairman, Russ Benham, is a very fine, very effective chair. I think the commission structures can work well. It requires tone at the top. It requires the right level of support from the oversight committees. It requires an administration, and this is important, that respects the independence of the SEC and the CFTC.
Yeah.
People think of the SEC as somehow it's part of the executive branch, like the Department of Treasury or the Agriculture Department is, but it's not. The SEC and the CFTC are actually independent agencies. During my time at the CFTC, it was well known that I told the Trump administration that I was not going to abide by their funding requests because the agency had been underfunded, and I went to Congress and said, look, I'm not beholden to the administration. We need additional funding, and I'm not going to be afraid to ask for it, and worked across the aisle. And so I do think these agencies, the SEC and the CFTC, can work well in their present structures if there's a will to do so, and if the joint oversight of the administration and Congress allows them to do their jobs. But I'm a little reluctant to comment on Warren Davidson's criticism of the SEC without either knowing well enough his proposals or that agency's internal politics well enough myself.
No problem. I want to jump to the recent ETF filed by BlackRock. Obviously, there was a lot happening in the space right now. We seem to also be seeing kind of a rush to a ton of entities starting to move into the space. Obviously, we've had several ETFs that have been denied by the SEC. Just your approach on this. I know, from the CFTC, it's a different scenario that plays out in this versus what happens over at the SEC with ETFs. But what is your thought on? Do you think this ETF could actually go through with BlackRock?
Well, let me actually come to this from a different way. That chart you put up is very interesting. Look at all the TradFi names on that chart.
Yep.
What I would say is this too is not surprising. If you actually look at the history of the first wave of the internet, it was the disruptors that came up first.
Yes.
In the late 1990s that created what we called the dot-com bubble. And then the bubble crashed, and there were some people out there saying that's it. People are done with e-commerce. They're never going to buy pet supplies online, and that's why pets.com crashed. No, in fact, that people did want to use e-commerce. It's just that they couldn't do it conveniently with the then current architecture. Buying pet supplies with 2G technology on a dial-up modem, waiting 3 weeks for the pet supplies to arrive was not exactly a great customer experience. It took the arrival of infrastructure of PayPal, of 3G and 4G technology, ultimately 5G technology. It took the arrival of Amazon and others to build out the space. In 2000, when the dot-com bubble crashed, there were less than 350 million people around the world using e-commerce. 10 years later, by 2020, by 2010, the number was over 2 billion, and today it's close to 6 billion. Yeah. E-commerce was the right idea, but the infrastructure wasn't there. I think the same is going to prove itself to be the case with an internet of value. It's not that people don't want to use digital networks to determine who holds value and who transfers value to whom. It's just that the infrastructure isn't there. And so charts like that now I'm not sure everybody on that chart is going to win in the end. But what it shows to me is that more mature players, we've had the disruptors, and the disruptors have done their job to basically champion a concept that people can start getting their heads around. Now you're going to see more mature players come into the space and looking for opportunity, and some of them will help transform it. Some of them will not. There will be some of the old disruptors who will still play a role in that future, and we'll have what we had in that first wave of the internet, a glorious mix of new and old disruptors and traditional players helping to build out this internet of value. And I think 10 years from now, we'll look back saying this was really the maturization of this innovation that's taking place now with these new entrants. And when you have a player like BlackRock leading the charge, that's if there's no better statement that this innovation is here to stay than that chart you just put up there with some of the leaders that are on that chart.
Yeah, and obviously Fidelity possibly trying to work their way in. We've also seen others.
Citadel, Nomura, and NASDAQ.
Well, yeah, EDX launched yesterday, this week, which is essentially Wells Fargo, Citibank, et cetera. But and they're already working on exchanges just opening now. Obviously, that's in more from an institutional side of things. But Patrick McHenry had an interesting tweet here, and it was based on this scenario of the BlackRock's filing for the Bitcoin Trust, and it was basically your move, is what he said. Let me kind of highlight that up there. SEC must not pick winners and losers based on inconsistent factors. I'll be watching this closely. Now, granted, there is a difference between what BlackRock has done and what many of the other incumbents that have tried to file an ETF were proposing. BlackRock also a little different, relationship with both lawmakers and also the SEC. So it is possible you could look at this on one side. Well, BlackRock's ETF is different, so the SEC could gain, fire cover by approving this, and not having to deal with GBDC as much over here from a Grayscale side of things. But with all that playing into it, does this look bad on Gensler if they do say, all right, we're going to go ahead and let this one go through?
Well, look, any chairman has to be conscious and cognizant of their power in granting licenses and in granting authorization to set up a level playing field. When I was chair at the CFTC, it was CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and CBOE, um, uh, 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 CBOT. They came into us with licenses for Bitcoin futures. But at the same time, we were looking at the license as a designated designated contract market for LedgerX, a disruptor,
Yep.
one of the new players. And we were very cautious and we were very cognizant of our duty to lay down a level playing field. That both disruptors and traditional industry players needed to know that when they came to the agency, well, they may have had their place in line. Their place in line wasn't determined by their size or their youth or inexperience. It was all based upon when they approached us, when they put in their filing, and we treated the biggest and the smallest with the same even-handed way. I think it's critically important that agencies do that, particularly so here in the United States, where we've always been made a home for innovation. And as my great friend and mentor, Dr. Richard Sandor, the creator of the Climate Exchange, the creator of the American Financial Exchange, likes to say, it's your disruptors who break down your door, and it may be the TradFis that come marching through, but you need both of them for innovation. And it's
Yeah.
very important for chairs of agencies to make sure they lay out a level playing field for both disruptors and incumbents as we move to the next phase of innovation in our markets.
Right. So, okay, so there is some things happening there with that. You've got ARK, 21 shares. They already had, theirs is active right now. So technically, ARK could be maybe even considered as the first ETF or almost in unison with maybe an approval on BlackRock. Again, back to my original question was, you get these ETFs rolling out, all at the time in which others are being denied. Again, this just looks bad on the SEC for Gensler. And to McHenry's point, it looks as though there are winners and losers being chosen. What has changed for Gensler to maybe approve these, other than maybe some filing architecture that these companies have constructed?
Well, I haven't studied the BlackRock application. I've read in some places that it's actually quite different than what's already before the commission. Maybe some of those different elements give it a winning combination. But more broadly, where the SEC has been on Bitcoin ETFs is to approve those that are based upon the CFTC regulated Bitcoin futures markets,
Right.
and to not allow those that are based upon the spot markets. And as I described to you earlier, for those historical reasons, that spot market doesn't have a market regulator. Now, the CFTC polices it for fraud, but doesn't set standards for how that marketplace operates the way it does for futures. It doesn't set standards for collateral management, doesn't set standards for customer handling, et cetera, et cetera. So the SEC can claim consistency in where there is a competent market regulator, the CFTC overseeing the market, it can establish a future. Now, again, I'm not at the SEC to gainsay that approach, but one of the advantages of a future passage of the McHenry-Thompson legislation in the House that would grant the CFTC oversight of the spot market is that no longer would the SEC have an objection to an ETF on spot Bitcoin, because now you'd have competent regulation of that spot market. And that would do several things that I think would really stimulate the market. For the first time, you would now have a full suite of Bitcoin and potentially Ethereum digital commodity trading markets. You'd have the futures, the hedging, the risk transfer markets. You'd have the spot fully regulated, and then you'd have an ETF on both spot and futures. And if you're a trader, having the full suite of ETFs, spot products, and derivatives allows you to now do arbitrage strategies, hedging
Mhm.
strategies. It really could be a catalyst for a revitalization of trading liquidity and market dynamics in the digital commodity space, which is Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Yeah, how likely would that happen? I mean, do you feel like that is
Well,
something
if,
that
if we
could
get
be
this House
architected
to
into
pass,
place?
yeah, look, I think if we get the House to pass this bill, I do think the Senate's going to come under considerable, in a funny kind of way. I think
A lot of
crypto
pressure.
is going to become part of the political landscape. We're going into an election in
Yeah.
2024. Crypto is a generational thing, Paul. I mean, it's one thing I talked about in my very first testimony.
Mm.
I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s generation. My older cousins went off to Vietnam and I got my draft notice, although the draft ended before I came of age. But, there was a divide between young people then and our older generation, or my parents, my grandparents, over things like the war in Vietnam and civil rights. And the older generation just didn't understand it, and they never understood it. They just eventually left the stage and younger people rose up. The same thing's going to happen here. I don't hold out a
Right.
lot of hope that the septuagenarians, some people call them the gerontocracy, that are in charge of financial management, with a few exceptions, are going to suddenly wake up tomorrow and say, suddenly I get crypto and I understand why it's an improvement over branch banking and 3-day settlement and high fees to move money around the world. But the people right behind them do get it. And so I think there's a generational element to this. And the people in Congress that are older and they're forming anti-crypto armies are going to look pretty silly, I think, 10 years from now, when the
Yeah.
next generation that grew up in a networked world, understands the power of digital networks, when they take their places on the global stage and the national stage, I think some of that old thinking is just going to go the way that some of that thinking from the 60s and 70s just went by the wayside.
Yeah, Chris, I hope you're right. I had a chance to live through the evolution of the birth of the internet. I was a young engineer at Microsoft, and we were getting a chance to do that and see it. And you're right, there was a lot of pushback from kind of the status quo of government at the time. But at the end, at the outset, finally they came to their senses and said, let's let this thrive. And it exploded. And it also, I still think it put the United States as the global power because it re-energized us in a technology age that kind of really set us apart from everyone else that we've seen in terms of growth.
One of the
I've
big
got one more
differences
clip.
between the
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, go ahead. No, I was going to say one of
I,
the big differences between that wave of the internet and this wave of the internet is that
yeah,
wave of the internet didn't come into a formidable array of government agencies charged
exactly.
with protecting people and their money.
Yes,
Society
big
has
difference.
long assumed government has a role to play there, and government does. But these
Mhm.
agencies don't want to yield much, and but that will come. It'll change with the generational changeover. I'm confident
Interesting
it will.
stuff. Speaking of these agencies, I've got one more clip for you, and this is Hester Pierce. Listen in.
However, and whenever he leaves, how committed is the staff to applying or enforcing the stance that everything in crypto besides Bitcoin is a security?
The way the commission goes will depend on who's running the commission.
Wow, that's just straight up. So clearly you have, I think, it appears that you have dissension in the ranks with these commissioners and their belief on one thing. How do you deal with that? Did that happen at the CFTC where you have your staff that says, hey, I have a different opinion on this, and how did you guys deal with that?
Yeah, look, these agencies attract a lot of really smart, accomplished people, and difference of opinion shouldn't be something we're afraid of. Difference of
No.
opinion is a healthy environment. As a chair, and I wrote about this in my book, Crypto Dad. I worked hard to build a consensus among senior division heads and leaders on our decision to greenlight Bitcoin futures. There was some concern about it, and we worked hard to build a consensus. And I built a consensus with my fellow commissioners, including at the time Russ Benham, who's now chairman of the agency,
Mm-hmm.
that had some disagreement with our process, but no disagreement with the ultimate direction, and supported our decision to greenlight Bitcoin futures. And so I think Hester Peirce, my good friend and fellow, she's crypto mom, is absolutely right. The tone from the top is going to make the difference. Now, I'll tell you one thing. every new chair is an opposite to the chair before. Whether they're of the same party or not, it doesn't matter. I reversed things that Tim Massad did. He was my predecessor.
Right.
And Heath Tarbert, who was my successor and a fellow Republican, changed things that I did, and Russ Benham's changed. There's always a pendulum swing, just as every presidency is a reversal of the prior presidency. The same happens at the agencies. I've said this publicly, and I'm not I don't get into name calling. I'm not here to criticize Gary Gensler, but I do think the current view of the SEC, we will look back and see it as an outlier. Not just, it's an outlier today in the global environment. All our economic competitors are going in a different direction than the SEC, but it's going to be an outlier in history. We're going to look back and say, this was the Empire Strikes Back against innovation, and eventually the empire, as you know, the trilogy loses out.
Yeah.
You can't stand astride the course of time and say, stop, I don't like where it's going, so I want it to stop. You can't stop innovation. What you have to do is channel it, which is what we tried to do, and I think we successfully did at the CFTC, and I think that's a model for other regulators. Channel this in a way. We do need to bring investor protection. We do need to look out for uninformed. We do need to make sure there's better disclosure. We need to catch and capture the bad guys and take them out of the markets. But we can't stop innovation. Our country relies on innovation. We need innovation for economic growth, for economic health, for greater financial inclusion, to lower cost, to take out some of the rent seeking that exists in our financial markets. And this is going to happen. The only question is whether the US is going to be a leader or a laggard, whether we're going to influence it or have others influence it. That's really the only question. But I'm confident that once we get our act together, we'll get back out into the forefront of this.
Well, you hit on the next area that I wanted to make a statement on. Is we did a video on Japan versus China in terms of Metaverse and NFTs and kind of the growth of smart contract, technology. And one thing that we were seeing within that video that we did, and for you guys go back and watch it, was the amount of regulatory structure that is already in place in Asia, especially in Japan. Japan is moving very briskly. China is also starting to embrace this at the speed in which MiCA in the EU, even though the EU has a lot of governmental, I would say, status of just being able to get it approved, it'll be a little bit slower. But when you look at NFTs, let's assume that we do finally get some sort of regulatory guidance. The SEC approves an ETF, and we feel like there's a little bit of softening on this whole crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum narrative. Next up is right behind it is going to be smart contracts and NFTs. Do you feel that we can get into play quickly? Because I feel like this is the explosion, much like the explosion we saw in the era of the internet. What are your thoughts?
So the answer is we can, but it's going to be hard. Let me back up a little bit. I actually spent a lot of time in Japan. I'm a member of the board of Nomura Securities, and I'm also an advisor to Nomura's Laser Digital company, which is building a portfolio of very interesting digital asset and digital network portfolio companies. The JFSA was one of that's the Japanese Financial Service Authority, was one of the first global regulators to put out frameworks for digital assets, and they recently refined those frameworks with some new legislation.
Yeah.
Japan has really been a leader in this area. They see it as an opportunity to advance their economy, to grow. And interestingly, I understand they've actually faced some pressure from US government to perhaps not be so out there. And they've quietly said, no, you do your thing and we'll do ours. And I think that's a common refrain around the world. I think the world is looking at the United States kind of tying itself up at knots, and they're not slowing down, they're forging ahead. Now, in terms of so to your question, the answer is the longer we wait to engage in this global innovation framework building, the more, again, our economic competitors, in some cases our economic adversaries like China, are going to plow ahead. They're not silly people. They're quite astute. They see where the United States is right now, and they see this as an opportunity. There's a Chinese phrase, which I can't pronounce, but it means passing on the curve. And it actually comes from different forms of racing, horse racing and others. In the curve, where the track bends, is where you get to overtake. And they view the United States right now as breaking for the curve of technology, and they see it as their opportunity to leap ahead. That's
Wow.
our economic adversary, China. Our economic friends see it the same way. That's the Europeans, the EU are forging ahead, the Brits are forging ahead, the Singaporeans are forging ahead, the Japanese are. And I've visited with all of them. I was in Brazil recently. I met with the securities regulator there. I was in the UK. I was in Japan. They scratch their head. They ask me some of the same questions you are. Why is the United States so far behind? Why is there not a framework? But I can see from their and understand from their comments is, okay, if you want to slow down for the turn, that's fine. But we're going into it hard. We're going to hit the gas as soon as we come out of it and pass you by. And those are friends and foes pretty much seeing the same opportunity right now.
Yeah, you've seen the, kind of the global transition start to take place here for sure. And I think that, to me, that's an expertise level that, unfortunately, we don't see in here on the crypto side a lot because we're so busy dealing with just the SEC and what Gensler's next Wells notice is going to be. And what we're going to see from that, especially for crypto traders and just investors here in the United States, which is, to me, is the biggest disservice that the government is doing right now is to the American people. The people that are saying, wait a minute, I have people in Japan, I have people in London, they're getting in on this and they're starting to create futures for themselves and their families. Is there anything that is, from a lawmaker standpoint that they look at this and say, we're really starting to affect Main Street pocketbooks here?
Yeah, well, I would argue that our regulatory negligence of not getting a framework out there is harming economic growth. But I would also say that our regulatory unwillingness to engage has allowed fraudulent activity to take place that perhaps might not have if there was a framework in place. Again, look at what we did at the CFTC by greenlighting Bitcoin futures. We actually inserted ourselves to be able to do the type of surveillance that has prevented fraud and manipulation in those markets. And so, again, I think that is the right model that other regulators should follow. I'm not here to criticize existing incumbents other than to say I think the way we approached it was a model. It was 5 years ago we greenlighted Bitcoin futures and it's working fine. Now we're seeing 5 years later, the Europeans and the Brits and the others putting frameworks in place. We were ahead of the game here in the United States. It's not like we didn't have the head start. Our innovators, most of the innovators come out of the United States. The United States was ahead of this.
Yeah.
But now we're breaking for the curve and our others see the opportunity to jump ahead. So it's really disappointing. It's as a fellow American and as someone who wants to see the growth take place here, has worked for that. It's disappointing. But, Jim Harper, who's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, posted last week a really interesting comment. He said, if you look at this in the long arc of history, all these different Wells notices and actions are kind of boring because it's just very short term. The thing to do right now for firms is keep building that infrastructure, building that architecture, because eventually this innovation is going to require that to succeed. Eventually, the United States we always get our act together in time. We were woefully unprepared for World War II, but boy, did we gear up first. I think we're going to see this new innovation in finance. And, slightly sympathetic to where we are, we have to recognize that up until recently, our banks, our financial system, our markets dominated the globe using that 19th and 20th century architecture.
Yeah.
It's understandable that there are many people in positions of power that say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's worked fine. Dance with the girl that got you here, dance with the person that got you here, and why take a risk on something? You can have some sympathy to that. But the counter to that is, but you can't stop the innovation. It was great while it lasted, But that same architecture that has been durable, has got us here, is very expensive. It's very slow. It's very imprecise. It's very exclusive. I wrote a piece in the American Enterprise Institute, a report recently talking about how exclusive our existing financial system is because it relies on sufficient identity to be able to actually access financial services. And if you're in a world of 8.5 billion people, if you're one of the 1.5 billion that don't have sufficiently credentialed identity, you can't access financial services. So if nothing else, the biggest indictment of the existing system is how exclusive it is. And that's something we do need to work on. So, but you can understand a little bit of that, generational divide simply because that financial system, the existing one, has served America so well for so long.
Yeah, for sure. Chris Giancarlo, former chair over at the CFTC, thank you again so much for stopping in today. We appreciate it.
Let's do it again soon, Paul. It's fun.
All right. All right. So you another hearing. This is the oversight of the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets. So this one is coming up this week. We'll give you guys a coverage on this. This could be the scenario that plays into how regulation and maybe where this falls. So especially around Bitcoin, Ethereum, and maybe to a certain extent some of the current tokens that are being deemed as securities out there. So make sure and stick around for those. And if you guys are not following us over on YouTube, we've created a new playlist, and this is our U.S. crypto regulation hearings playlist. It has all of our best hits on this. Goes back for quite some time. But if you want to catch up on this, maybe you're brand new to our channel, or maybe you're brand new, you're just hearing about Blackrock's filing, and you're saying, wait a minute, maybe I need to catch up on what's happening in the world of Bitcoin. Listen into these hearings, because this will start to paint a picture to get you better informed on what's happening at Capitol Hill, and maybe how the framework of not only regulators, but also many of the financial institutions are starting to make steps in the right direction. If you're not part of our Diamond Circle, jump in, just click the link down below. And of course, if you want to catch me, it's out there on Twitter, @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.